Hitman 2-3, this is Hitman 2. What's the status? Over. 2-3, stand by. Goliath, this is 2 Bravo. Request permission to engage enemy paratroopers and attempt to snatch a grid Papa uniform 259er, 119er. Break. Enemy is unaware of our presence at this time. Over. Solid copy. Hitman 2-3, Echo 5 Foxtrot. This is Hitman 2 Action.
Hey, good evening, everybody. This is Ben Powers coming at you from the Commander's Voice. I have a very special guest tonight. It's Ms. Joanie Melillo, who is the daughter of Master Sergeant Vincent Melillo, who is one of the original members of Merrill's Marauders. I'm very, very excited about this episode because we're doing it in honor of Father's Day, which is coming up this Sunday, and it's also Miss Joanie's birthday tomorrow on the 18th of June. So this is a very special episode for us. Joanie was a major cheerleader in getting Congress to award Merrill's Marauders a Congressional Gold Medal, and we're going to be talking about that tonight. But first, I just want to welcome you to the podcast.
Well, thank you. It's really good to be here, and I feel really honored that you asked me to do this for Father's Day, because every so many years, my birthday and Father's Day are the same day. So even though Daddy died Christmas Eve 2015, I feel like I'm bringing him back to life a little bit.
Oh, that's wonderful. And I'm so excited to have this conversation. So the first question as we jump right in, Miss Joanie, that I wanted to talk to you about is if you could just share some information about your dad's experiences in the Army and specifically with Merrill's Marauders.
Well, Daddy joined the Army before World War II, before the United States entered World War II. He joined the Army in 1940, and he joined really for adventure. And he wanted to go to the Philippines, but at that time, the only people who could go to the Philippines were people with prior service. So he went to Panama. He was sent to Panama and served with the old 33rd Infantry. And he spent a year in Panama, and then he spent 2 years in Trinidad. And on December 7th, 1941, they were on a ship leaving Panama, and they weren't sure where they were going. And they were headed to the West Indies, to Trinidad. And when Dad's 3-year enlistment was, and they trained, while they were in Panama, they did jungle training before the jungle school was ever established. Amazing. And they would go on 100-mile hikes, like from Fort Reed in Panama, they went to Villa Hada, and they bivouac out there for so long, and then come back. And Dad has a lot of stories about about being in Panama, and the people, the 2nd Battalion was Merrill's Marauders. The entire 2nd Battalion made up what came from the Caribbean. And the way that happened was after FDR and Winston Churchill in 1943 at the Quebec Conference, they decided to form a top secret unit. And it would be all volunteers. So the president, FDR, issued, a plea for volunteers. And Daddy and the rest of his men that he was good friends with, their 3-year tour was up, so they were headed back to the States. And they stopped off in Puerto Rico. They took them into a big room, and they wanted volunteers. And everybody started volunteering. And Daddy, who was raised in an orphanage, those were his brothers. He wasn't going to go. He wasn't going to let them go without him. So he went. But they didn't know where they were going. All they knew was that it was a top secret mission, and they volunteered for a, quote, hazardous and dangerous mission, expecting high casualties. I don't think anybody told them, but they were actually a suicide unit, which they didn't know at the time.
Which is just amazing to me. And you mentioned Churchill, FDR, and the Quebec Conference, and the long-range penetration mission for this, hazardous duty behind enemy lines that these guys signed up for. And you and I were talking a little bit before we hit record. And what I find amazing is you've got these men, they're volunteering for hazardous duty. but they're treated almost like stepchildren. They're a provisional unit. Nobody's taking real responsibility for them. They're launched behind enemy lines and almost left to their own devices. Whereas, as we were talking about with the British version, the Chindits, they had more experience operating in Burma, but they had coordinated for aerial resupply, aerial evacuation, aerial close air support from an American unit. And you don't see a similar type of coordination from Merrill's Marauders, which I just find fascinating.
Well, when there were 3 areas that the Marauders volunteered from. They volunteered from the Caribbean, Panama and Trinidad. Their Colonel McGee was 2nd Battalion. He came out of there also. And then they came from stateside. And then there were the combat seasoned guys that came from the South Pacific, Guadalcanal, New Guinea, Vela La Vela, all those battles. And so they met in the stateside in Panama. They met out in California and at a post out there. I was going to say Fort Slocum, but that's in New York. That's the wrong fort. But anyway, they met out there and they stayed in a holding area until they could leave, and they left on the Lure Line. And the Lure Line was Hawaii's luxury liner that had been converted into a troop ship. And they had no idea where they were going. Some people thought they might be going to North Africa. So the people from the Caribbean and from stateside boarded the Lure Line, and then they headed to pick up the combat season troops. And they stopped, I think, in I forget where they stopped, but I think they weren't able to get off the ship. And they did stop at some point where they were allowed off the ship. And Daddy's memories of that don't really coincide with what actually happened. Daddy said, "Oh, the town was so nice. They took us out and they let us walk around this big field around and around to get exercise, and they gave us things to drink and something to eat." And I later read an account in one of the history books, and the town was so terrified to have that many soldiers who had been on ships that they confined them like to a racetrack, So the dad said that when they left, some of the men, they were so excited about being off, that they had to send somebody to get some of the guys to do that.
I can only imagine.
It's a good thing they put them in the racetrack, But they landed. Well, I want to tell a funny story that has something to do with Bob Passanisi, who is the Merrill's Marauders spokesperson, historian, and he's the creator of the beautiful Merrill's Marauders Association website that anybody can go to. It's called the Merrill's Marauders Association homepage. So when they were getting on board the Lure Line, they asked people going to the flank what their MOS was. And Bob said his was radio communications. So something went wrong with the ship, and they called for Bob's expertise, and he fixed whatever was wrong, which made him a shining boy in the captain's eyes. And so the captain let Bob do a nightly radio show.
Oh, wow.
And nobody knew where they were going, but Bob Passanisi actually found out. He wasn't supposed to, but he found out. But he couldn't tell the rest of the men where they were going. So every night he ended the radio show with the song of India, because that's where they were headed. They were headed to Bombay. But I don't know whether any of them had ever figured that out or not. But then once they got to Bombay, then they went into training. They went to Marguerite and I forget where else to have Brigadier General Ord Wingate. They still had no name, no insignia, no colors, and they were being trained in jungle warfare, long range penetration patrol by Brigadier General Ord Wingate. Chindit,
yes,
the ones that were forced out of Britain, and Lieutenant General Wilson, he retired as a lieutenant general. He was just a young lieutenant with Merrill's Marauders in 1943 and 44. And Lieutenant General Wilson said that Merrill's Marauders were like a political football between the British and the Americans, you know, because you have Stilwell over here who wanted him, and Lord Louis Mountbatten who had him, you know, and it was like a tug of war, you know, and then you have all these men out here that aren't alive and aware of what's going on. But Stilwell was successful, and in January of or late December, when 1944 began, they were under the China-Burma India Theater.
Yes, ma'am. Now, for listeners who may not be up on the history, what was the objective of Merrill's Marauders? Once the unit was formed, we know they're going behind enemy lines, like you said, long-range penetration. But what were they penetrating to? What was the objective?
Their objective was the Michinout airfield in northern Burma. It was an all-weather airfield, and the Japanese controlled the airspace. And the objective in seizing the airfield was to open up the airfield so that the Lido and the Burma Road could be connected, and a pathway be forged into China, who was one of our allies during that war.
Yes, ma'am. All right.
Daddy said he would tell people, because he was also a Korean War 5th Regimental Combat Team veteran, and he would go, yes, in World War II, I fought with the Chinese, and in the Korean War, I fought against them. You know?
Geopolitics can get very complicated down at the individual soldier level.
Yeah, it really can, you know. And but anyway.
So you mentioned they get to India, they start training, they get some guidance from the Chindits, from General Wingate. I mean, this is an ad hoc unit, guys coming from the Caribbean, guys coming from the United States, combat vets coming out of the South Pacific. How long did they have together to train before they had to cross the line of departure and go into combat?
They were, let's see, I think they got there in August. They had several months there, you know, several months where they trained. You know, they were taught river crossings, you know, using your rifles to make you know, for your equipment and everything. They trained for quite a while. But the good thing about the 2nd Battalion, I guess, and the people who came out of the South Pacific, they were actually fighting in jungle warfare. And then the 2nd Battalion, you know, had gone through, they had done maneuvers all over the jungle, you know, in the Caribbean. And what they did, because the people from the United States and the 2nd Battalion were not combat seasoned. And so what they did, they took some of the men from the other battalion from the South Pacific, and they put them into the other two, which caused problems because the men from the South Pacific were like the men from the Caribbean. They'd been together for a long time, and they didn't want to be separated, you know, but they were there, you know, as the experienced people to help the people who had not had combat experience. So it was a good thing.
Yes, ma'am.
And one of those men is alive today, and that's Gabriel Kinney. He is one of the 7 surviving Marauders. He just turned 100.
Oh, my goodness.
And Alabama. And his brother, who was also a CBI veteran, died last year at 107.
Oh my goodness, that's amazing. So just for context, you said there's 7 surviving Marauders, and this is roughly a regimental size unit. How many soldiers were in the unit at full strength?
Well, they were a little bit under a regimental size unit. They weren't quite 3,000. You know, and then some of the men were left behind to assist with the airdrops, because Merrill's Marauders were kept completely alive by C-47 airdrops. I put a little C-47 back there on the shelf.
Yep, we can see her. That's awesome. My favorite airplane.
You know, but they were kept completely alive by the airdrops. And what they had to do, you know, they had to clear out spaces, you know, for the parachutes to land. and a lot of times if there was a battle going on, they fell outside the perimeter.
Yes, ma'am. So once they start the operation to go behind enemy lines to start seizing the airfield, I know they had. What was the distance that they had to cross? I know it was a tremendously long march.
Well, it was. I know when they started the second day, my dad was actually one of the people on the 5-man patrol where the first Merrill's Marauder was killed. That was Private Landis. And he was killed the second day into it. They were at a village, a collection of Bashi huts in a place called Lamanga. And Daddy and his foxhole buddy, who came out of the Caribbean, they were the last 2 living survivors, from that patrol.
Oh, wow.
And Landis was one of the youngest, and he was a veteran of South Pacific battles. And I know the first time Daddy talked about that, I started recording Daddy when he was in his 60s. And when he told me, that story, after all those years, he still teared up.
I can only imagine.
Yeah. But you were asking about the distance. The Marauders were sort of unique. There were 3 battalions, but they didn't travel together. They were all going in different directions. And it was under 1,000 miles, and it was, there was going forward, coming back. So it's really kind of hard. There are different figures, but it was under 1,000 miles. And one of the few times they were together was at the Battle of Napunga, when the 2nd Battalion, which my dad was with, they were surrounded by the Japanese for almost 2 weeks. And the 1st and the 3rd Battalion had to fight their way back to rescue them.
Oh, my goodness.
And that was a wicked battle. I think from men that I've talked to from the 2nd Battalion who remember it, well, they all remember it. They won't ever forget it. And they were rescued on Easter Sunday, 1944.
Wow.
And one of Dad's buddies, one of the 14 Nisei, the Japanese-American interpreters, Roy Matsumoto played a pivotal role in that. And Daddy kept in touch, at reunions and over the phone with occasional phone calls with Roy, and who lived out in Seattle. And Roy was one of the 6 Marauders who have lived to the age of 100 or more. We have 2, I think, that made it to 102.
That's
and,
absolutely
there may
amazing.
be others that we don't know about, but we know for sure that there were 2. And Roy, when I was talking about how they never forgot it, Roy's family was like a family from the Civil War. He was born in the United States, educated in Japan. His parents had moved back to Japan. So he had brothers fighting for Japan while he was fighting as a linguist with Merrill's Marauders. And after the mission was over, Roy told Daddy on the 70th anniversary of the battle, the 70th Easter Sunday anniversary of the Battle of Napunga, I think I mentioned to you that we celebrated that out at Fort Benning.
Yes, ma'am.
With the buffet, and we had a surprise cake for Daddy, that said 70th anniversary, Battle of Napunga. And all the Rangers that saw the cake came up and, did like group photos and everything with Daddy. So that evening, he said, I would really like to talk to another Marauder today. And it was 2nd Battalion. And I said, well, Daddy, Roy's the only one I can think of. And so we called Roy, and the 2 of them mostly focused on the Battle of Napunga, and they talked about the fried chicken and bread that was airdropped to them, which was the first decent meal that they had had in God knows how long. And so Roy told Daddy during that conversation that every Easter Sunday after 1944, his family, which was Japanese American, had fried chicken. And then I just got an email from Kieran this year, one of his daughters. He has 2 daughters, and she told me that they still had fried chicken on Easter Sunday
Oh, wow.
for 20. But then the sad part of that was she called Daddy the next morning to tell him that Roy had died during the evening.
Oh, what a
And
shame.
Roy, by the way, is one of 3 Marauders. I don't know if I can remember all of their names. Lieutenant General Sam Wilson is one, Roy Matsumoto, and I believe another Nisei, Edward Mitsukato, I think his name is. They have 3 Congressional Gold Medals. They will have Merrill's Marauders. They have the OSS, Office of Strategic Services, which were attached to Merrill's Marauders. And they also have the MIS, the Military Intelligence Service.
That's amazing.
So those 3 will be recipients. You know, they will be honored because the Congressional Gold Medal isn't an individual award.
Yes,
it's a unit award, you know, like the Presidential Unit Citation. And so it honors them. And I think it's really amazing that a unit as small as Merrill's Marauders, less than 3,000, would have 3 that have 3 Congressional Gold Medals.
That is amazing. That truly, truly is. So how much weight did your dad lose? Did he ever mention how just decimated he was?
You know, one of the things that I regret, Ben, is that a lot of people have photos of their dads from the Merrill's Marauder mission. And I don't have any of Dad, but there was a man with the OSS, a lieutenant, who took some photos. And I'm still hoping that someday those photos will surface, because he took a lot of them, but a war was going on, you know. So, and he promised he'd get them back to the men, but it didn't happen. And I'm hoping that, you know, that they will come up. But at the Battle of Napunga, they were described as walking skeletons. And the 1st and 2nd Battalion, that the 1st and 3rd Battalion that rescued them, the smell at Napunga was so overwhelming that many of the men vomited as they were fighting their way up the trail, you know, to get to them, because the mules, you know, had polluted the water holes. The food fell outside the perimeter. And, you know, they were just walking skeletons with glazed eyes.
Yes, ma'am.
And then, you know, and that was at Napunga, but they had to keep going. They had to keep marching. And then, you know, and then they had malaria, dysentery. Daddy had dysentery really bad. So I figure he was probably skinny as a rail. Most of them were. And he said he had to hold on to, they wanted to put him on a mule, I think, to get up the Kumung Mountains. But Daddy kept falling off of it, so he held onto the mule's tail.
Oh my
but
goodness.
There was a disease, Mike typhus. I don't know why, but when they were climbing up, you know, the Kumung Mountains, which are sort of the foothills of the Himalayas, a lot of the men were stricken with Mike typhus, and many of them didn't survive. And but at Napunga, surprisingly, after being, I keep bouncing back and forth, but I just keep remembering things. The Marauders suffered less casualties, you know, than the Japanese. The Japanese, I think, were in the 100.
Oh my goodness.
And the Marauders didn't. But let's see, how many men? Right now, there's Gilbert Howland, who's 98. He's a triple CIB. He's World War II Korea, like Daddy, but he also did 2 tours in Vietnam. And he lives in New Jersey, and he was with 2nd Battalion. And Gabriel Kinney, the one who was 100, he was with 2nd Battalion. Russell Handler, who lives in Pennsylvania, he turns 97 this month, I believe. And he was with 2nd Battalion. And I believe Rocco DeLuca, I'm not sure, may have been another. And that's 4 I mentioned, you know. So, but there aren't that many left, you know.
Not
and
at all.
They're all of them are unique. And every one of them has a story. It's different. It's, who was it, Studs Terkel said that all the people are are walking libraries, and
Yes,
that's
ma'am.
the truth. People would just ask them their stories, you know.
Well,
And I'm so grateful that, you know, when Daddy remembered everything, you know, that I was able, I mean, well, he remembered things up until he died. In fact, a month before he died, about a month and a half, I had a Rosie social at Fort Benning. I also started the 13th chapter in the nation of the American Rosie the Riveter Association.
oh, okay, great.
And so I had, it was the anniversary of the end of World War II or something in 2015, and nobody had done anything around here. So I decided to have a Rosie social. And I invited World War II veterans. I had, I think, 3 CVI veterans, a tail gunner from one of the planes in Europe, and about 12 Rosie Rosie the Riveters. And so at that social, Daddy learned to play the bones. I keep going back and forth. But Daddy did 2 songs and entertained at the Rosie the Riveter social. And I have to say, I have to talk about the bones. Dad, which I've shared with you, was orphaned by the 1918 flu epidemic. He was 3 months old when his mother died. He was the 5th child of Italian immigrants, and he was raised in Gladstone, New Jersey, at the Villa O'Connor Orphanage by the Sisters of St. John the Baptist. Well, I guess maybe after the boys' dormitory caught on fire, and maybe that's when they moved him to the boys' home in Arlington, New Jersey, and he learned to play the bones. And they were actually rib bones at one time, but what Daddy used were like wooden curved sticks, and they're a percussive instrument. And so Daddy knew hundreds of songs that nobody's ever heard of, you know, and he would recite all these little ditties, you know. I learned cadences from him that they sang in the military. And in fact, after he died, I walked around the track field in front of headquarters building. I walked around and around, and I would just recite the cadences, you know, that Daddy taught me, trying to keep a good rhythm going. But
it's just wonderful, the connection that you have with your dad. So I don't want to kind of rush to the end of the story, but there's so many more things that I do want to talk about. So for listeners, after this incredibly long 1,000-mile trek or almost 1,000-mile trek, you know, losing weight, dealing with disease, dealing with Japanese patrols, the unit eventually reaches the airfield and they succeed in their mission. Is this correct?
Oh, that they succeeded in their mission, yes. They accomplished their mission, but when they got to the airfield, out of those almost 3,000 men, there were approximately 200 that were combat capable. And it's a miracle that they were able to seize the airfield, which they did. And Bob Passanisi and Gabriel Kinney are 2 of those men that were combat capable. What happened, Colonel Hunter, who was actually the longest serving commander of Merrill's Marauders, he commanded them under the British, and he brought them home to Michigan because General Merrill had a heart attack.
Yes, ma'am.
And Colonel Hunter was not given orders to take the town of Michigan. Their objective was the airfield. Well, not taking the town, and I don't know, it wasn't that long, but it was long enough for the Japanese to fortify the town. So when the airfield was seized, replacements started coming in. There were about 2,500 replacements through the 5307, most with no combat experience, coming into an ongoing battle. And they suffered heavy losses.
Yes, ma'am.
In fact, one of them was just buried this week. He was an MIA whose remains were returned to, I think, Long Bottom, Ohio. And he was buried on the 12th after 77 years.
That's just absolutely amazing. And as you indicated, the 5307th, that's the composite number of Merrill's Marauders. It was the 5307th, Provisional Unit.
provisional, right?
So it didn't even have a title of being an infantry or a combat arms unit, although it was a combat arms organization. And they just kind of disbanded at the end of the war, right? They just kind of.
Oh yeah, what General Wilson said, which I think is really General Wilson said on August 10th, 1944, Merrill's Marauders. There were less than 100 Merrill's Marauders left. The other men were the replacement. And he said the 5307th disbanded without a whimper.
Oh my goodness.
Quote, without a whimper. Nothing. It was like a leaf floating in the wind. Nobody knew, and they didn't get a welcome home. There was no ticker tape parade. There was nothing. They just got absorbed or got out or went on to serve with the 475th, which became the Mars Task Force.
Yes, ma'am. But interestingly enough, through your efforts, and now I'd like to talk about the Congressional Gold Medal, a lot of that has been sort of rectified in history. At least folks know who Merrill's Marauders are, and they understand the contribution, and they actually have a tremendous role to play in the lineage of our special operations forces. So could you tell us a little bit about the Congressional Gold Medal efforts that you cheerleaded?
Yes, and I am going to brag a little bit because my dad had to quit school after the 7th grade, was offered a battlefield commission, which he turned down in Korea because he didn't think he had the education for it, finished high school in the Army. And the idea, we're talking just the idea to pursue getting a Congressional Gold Medal and the other national recognition, which I will talk about if we have time, came from my dad. And how the Congressional Gold Medal came about, I was doing a newsletter for Major General Ken Lohr, out at Fort Benning, who started the National Ranger Memorial Foundation, where all the stones are in front of the Ranger stones in front of the headquarters building. And it was 2010, and the MIS, Military Intelligence Service, had just been awarded a Congressional Gold Medal. And so Daddy always proofed my newsletters. I'd say, okay, Daddy, read this. And the one I gave him to read was about 3 of the Marauders who were in Ranger Hall of Fame, who were going to be honored by the Congressional Gold Medal. And he saw his buddy Roy Matsumoto's name there, and he said, there's Roy's name. And he said, he's getting the Congressional Gold Medal, and he said, why can't we get this for the rest of the men? And I thought, well, why not? So I proposed it to the Merrill's Marauders Proud Descendants, which was an organization formed after our father's organization disbanded. And, we had to legally form an organization and do all the legwork so that they could just come, and relax. So I proposed it to the board, and they embraced it. And then it's just been another battle. In fact, getting the Congressional Gold Medal, in my opinion, was not just as hard, but you could compare it to the difficulty in getting it to the difficulty that the Marauders faced in trying to get to Michigan, because it was a battle. You go up here, and then you'd be dropped down again. And the first bill, that was in 2010, the first bill wasn't introduced until 2016. And then I had Johnny Isaacson. I didn't do it. I was referred to a person on his staff here in Georgia, and he introduced the bill in the Senate. We had to go through 3 two-year Congressional Gold Medal, congressional sessions for the bill to pass, which it did last year. And then President Trump signed it into law in October. Right now, the gold medal is in the process of being designed. And in fact, I think it's, I don't know how many designs were sent to the committee. And the committee, I just received word today that a design, I think has been selected, and it will now go to the engravers. And it's our hope that the Congressional Gold Medal will be finished by the end of 2021, and it will be unveiled at a ceremony, at an official ceremony that will be hosted by Nancy Pelosi, and it will be by invitation only. and only one Congressional Gold Medal is minted, and that goes to the Smithsonian. And then the rest of us will have bronze replicas.
That's still wonderful, though. What a great achievement. I'm so happy that this finally happened for y'all.
I want to tell you about the second national recognition, if I have time here.
Please.
And it was in 2014, and Daddy and I had traveled to. I had been sick for a while, and we were finally able to take a trip. So Daddy wanted to see his sister Teresa Diaconte, who lived in New Jersey. They talked frequently on the phone, but they had not seen each other since 1945.
Oh, wow.
And they were the last two from a blended family. Daddy was the last of five. When he was reclaimed around age 10 or 11 by the father he didn't know, his dad had married another woman who lost her husband in the epidemic, had 3 children. Being good Catholics, they went on and had 6 more. So Teresa was the last child from their marriage, and Daddy was the last child from the first marriage. So I drove him up there, and we were returning to Georgia on D-Day in 2014, and it was the 70th anniversary. And, and Daddy was, he was excited. He was on a high from having seen his sister, and then all the radios, that they were going with stories about D-Day, the TV stations. So at every restaurant that Daddy and I stopped at, and every rest area, Daddy would walk up to strangers. He never knew a stranger, and he'd say, "Do you know what day this is?" And then he'd tell him, and then he'd give him his little card, Merrill's Marauder Korean War, and explain Merrill's Marauder to him. And we got it. He did that over and over, So people didn't walk away. They would just stand and listen to him and be real attentive. And so at one of the trips, he looked at me and he said, "Why don't Merrill's Marauders have a national day?" And I said, "Well, Daddy," I said, "probably because nobody knows about you." I said, and except maybe Army Rangers, and nobody's ever heard of your battles like Mapunda, Michinow, and Wallaboom. And I said, and they can't even pronounce them. But then, I started thinking about it, and I thought, why can't they have a national day? So I looked at all the dates when we got back to Georgia to see the significant dates that were left for that year, and there was only one, and it was August 10th, 2014. It's the anniversary of the 70th anniversary of the unit disbanding in Burma. So again, I go to the Merrill Marauders attendance, and I say, we don't have much time, but what if we get the governors of every state in the nation to issue a proclamation proclaiming August 10th, 1944 as National World War II Merrill Marauder Day? And they were all for it. And at that time, Dan, there wasn't as many different avenues in social media.
Yes, ma'am.
So we could be more focused, if that makes sense.
It sure does.
And little more than a month. Well, the problem with that was not anybody could just call up a governor in a state. The request had to come from a person that lived in that state. And the proud descendants were able to cover a lot of the state, but not all of them. It was a massive grassroots effort involving thousands of people. And it happened, and there was only one state, California. And they couldn't, they had, at that time, we couldn't get through their bureaucracy to the right person. We went to the right person that was listed, but it was the wrong person.
Oh, no.
And so they were the only ones that didn't participate. But then with the Congressional Gold Medal, the state of California was the first state for their legislature to issue a document that was sent to Congress and the president urging, it was in 2019, congratulating Merrill's Marauders on their anniversary and urging Congress and the president to pass the Merrill's Marauder Congressional Gold Medal Act.
Outstanding.
So, Daddy had no idea that his little comments could set all that into motion. Now, he didn't, once again, the Congressional Gold Medal took an army. of people and support to get it passed. And thank God everybody stayed with it. But what happened is, when we first started out, there were a lot of Merrill's Marauders who were alive. But as the years went by, people's enthusiasm would wane, because their father had died and they didn't have quite the commitment, which is understandable that they might have had. And it was just really hard to keep the momentum going. But one of the people who wrote a letter was Ralph Puckett, who just was given the Medal of Honor,
Yes, ma'am. Absolute hero.
Yes, he is, and Ralph and Daddy were two of the Korean War veterans that continue to be recognized by the South Korean government.
That's amazing.
Here locally.
Yes, ma'am.
Like when on the 60th anniversary of the Korean War, the Little Angels came to Columbus, and the Little Angels, they're an amazing group of little entertainers. I think you have to quit once you turn 15 because you're too old. But they, through song and music and dance, they tell the history of South Korea. And Daddy was one of 6 Korean War veterans who were given their little peace medal the year that they came here.
Oh, that's an absolutely lovely story.
There, and I can't remember the names of the other people. I think Secretary of the Army, Bill Calloway. Yeah.
That's just amazing. So we're just about out of time. I wanted to bring one last point up because you did mention it, that folks who might be interested in the history of Merrill's Marauders before all these efforts took place were probably just currently serving Rangers. And it is interesting, based off their mission, the fact that they were, hardcore light infantry, long range penetration specialists. They're a part of the lineage of the Ranger Regiment today, are they not?
Right, they are. They were not Rangers during World War II. That recognition didn't come until the Vietnam War, when the long-range patrols in Vietnam selected Merrill's Marauders as their lineage, the 5307, 475th. And in fact, one of the units was actually in Vietnam was actually called Merrill's Marauders.
And your dad's a member of the Ranger Hall of Fame, is he not?
He is.
That's awesome. That's very cool.
Yeah. I know, and then when the 75th Ranger Regiment, the new Rangers, were formed, they selected the Merrill's Marauder patch as their crest. And Dad was George's last Merrill's Marauder, last living Merrill's Marauder, and military intelligence building out at 75th Ranger Regiment was posthumously named Melillo Hall. In recognition of Daddy. But there's one replacement in Georgia. His name is Stanley Sassine. He lives in Atlanta, and he is the last living replacement of those men that flew in when they reached Michigan.
And they're all considered recipients of the Congressional Gold Medal. Yes. Right.
The way that works is the Marauders and the replacements who served with the 5307 up until it disbanded on August 10th will be honored by it. However, Ben, anybody, a coin collector, somebody with just an interest in history, anyone can purchase one of the Congressional Gold Medals.
Oh, interesting. That I didn't know. That's very interesting.
Yeah, because there are a lot of people who just collect the military ones. So I didn't know that either. But yes, anyone can purchase one.
Absolutely fantastic. Well, everybody, we're just about out of time. It's been another fun evening for me, at least, doing the Commander's Voice podcast with one of my new favorite people, Miss Joanie. Thank you so much for being on tonight. Just a wonderful, wonderful story. I can just sense the great connection between you and your dad, and I'm really happy this is going to be our Father's Day episode. So thank you so much for coming on the show.
Can I end it the way Daddy would have ended it?
Of course.
He ended everything with a little ditty. He would sing a song, and then he would say, shave and a haircut, 2 bits. Who you gonna marry? Tom Mix. It shows you how old he was. He would be 103 this year.
That's amazing. What a great way to go out. Miss Joanie, thank you so much for being on tonight. All right. You have a good night. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.